Morning, team. Are you getting tighter and tighter as the camp rolls on, or are you just getting more on red cordial and pumped up, or what? Tired? Everyone's like, tired? Okay, good. That's me too. But hey, we'll try and make it through the next 54 minutes together. I want to look at a very controversial topic today, and that is those parts of the Bible that you're going to get slammed for. I was at a party recently, a friend's birthday party, and I was chatting with this guy, interesting bloke, and he turns out he was a lawyer in some really interesting cases, and we were talking about some of that. He said, "So what do you do?" I said, "Oh, I teach theology." He goes, "Oh, geology." He said, the minerals boom would be good for you, wouldn't it? I said, "It would, except that I teach theology." He's like, "Oh, God. I mean, oh, yeah, that's God, right, okay." I'm like, yeah, that's... And straight out of the box, without any polite bow before the karate bout, he said to me, "So, what God?" I'm like, "The God of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian Bible." He goes, "Can you seriously believe in a God that would order people to go out and kill men, women, and children of the Canaanites? Could that ever be moral?" And I went, "Yeah, lovely weather, isn't it? Kind of great party here." Actually, I said to him, to be honest, he kind of asked it. I hope I'm not being biased here, but he kind of asked it in a bit of a smarty pants kind of a way, like kaboom, slam, that got you, didn't it? And I said, "Look, you're a smart guy. Do you want me to just try and give you some cheap bumper sticker answer in 30 seconds, or did you want an intelligent discussion about a complicated issue?" And he kind of realized that there was more than just a little 5-second discussion point. And I said, "By the way, let me ask you a question, just so we calibrate what we mean by morality. The bombing of Hiroshima, could that ever be morally defended?" And he kind of took a step back and he said, "Oh, that's a really complicated historical question." And I said, "Thank you, so's the one that you've asked me. Let's talk about it intelligently." And he kind of went, oh. And to be honest, there's kind of this belief at the moment that Christians don't have a brain, and that we just believe our stuff by the wool having pulled over our eyes by incredibly charismatic and persuasive pastors like me. Yeah, right. As if I could make you do anything that you didn't want to do and I wouldn't want to try. I'm inviting you to think critically about this. I'm inviting you to use your brain and to think about the Bible hard, just as you do any other aspect of your life, just as you do in your studies, I hope. Your mum didn't send me to say that, by the way. But because... yeah, I just think that the Bible's massively under attack. Let me read you from Richard Dawkins, who's kind of the Pope of atheism, the General Conference President of atheism. He says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction." Fiction, ouch, that bit hurt too. "Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. A misogynistic," what does that mean? Hates women. Oh, they didn't give you that master's for nothing, did they? Misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal. That's a good word. Come on, infanticidal. Loves killing infants. Genocidal. Loves killing people on the basis of race. Filicidal. Kills his family. Pestilential. Pesty. Megalomaniacal, loves power way too much. Sadomasochistic, this is like a vocabulary test, isn't it? This guy can really dish out a soundbite. Sadomasochistic, enjoys the pain of others. Capriciously malevolent bully. I don't think he likes him. Is that the impression that you're getting from that? And he says, so what I'd like to do this morning is to look at the two toughest Old Testament passages that I know. You may know others, but these are the two toughest ones I've had flung at me. The first one is that horrible story about the mass rape and dismemberment of a young woman in the city of Gibeah, just near Jerusalem. That's... And the second one is God's apparent command to go out and kill the Canaanites. Let's see if we can make some sense of that whole thing, okay? Maybe we'll do the Gibeah one first, the mass rape one first. And just so you get what Richard Dawkins is saying, he says there are two ways in which Scripture might be a source of morals or rules for living. One is by direct instruction, for example, the Ten Commandments, ... The other is by example. God or some biblical character might serve as a role model. Okay, so you get it? That's how he's telling you to read the Bible. I want you to question this right from the start. Read the Bible. How do you get your morals out of the Bible? Well, from a commandment. Do you agree with that? Yeah? I do. Or by example of some character like God as a role model. Agree? Yeah, I'd agree with that. Is that the complete list, though, of how you read the Bible? It's a pretty dumb list, actually. Because it assumes, and people often assume this, it assumes that everything the Bible reports, it approves of. What about a negative role model? What about the many times when characters are negative role models? Does that mean that if the Adelaide Advertiser, isn't it, reports some horrible rape scene, that the editor approves of that? Or is the editor just telling you the truth of what happens? So let's look at that story out of Judges. Book of Judges, the key thing that happens in the book of Judges is Israel becomes pagan. Israel starts copying the people around them. The best commentary on that I know of, Daniel Block, he talks about the Canaanization of Israel. It's where Israel kind of gives up their distinctive way of living and becomes a lot like the Canaanites around them. And then you see that happening. You see... Anyway, let me just read you the story and then I'll try and put it in some more background. In those days, Judges 19 verse 1, in those days Israel had no king. That's an interesting start. Okay, it becomes important later, but I'll let you wonder about that now. Now a Levite, that's a guy from we'd say a pastor's kid, I guess, a guy from a priest's or church leader's family, lived in a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim. He took a concubine, that's a common law relationship, this is a de facto wife, from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem, Judah. And after she'd been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return, literally to speak to her heart. And he has servants and donkeys, and he goes in there. And to cut a long story short, I won't go into all the detail today. Her father welcomes him. Oh, great to see you back, pal. And you're thinking, oh, this is nice. She cheated on him, but he's gone back after her to say, I'm sorry, can we get it back together? I love you. Can we kickstart our relationship again? That's good, right? Isn't it? That's a feel-good rom-com. Well, not quite. But it's a nice romantic movie. And the father welcomes him in, so he must hopefully be a good bloke. It's great to see you. Please come in and have a meal. Have another meal. Have another meal. Have another meal. Have another meal. And it becomes this massive thing where the dad's trying to fatten him up and feed him and welcome him. And eventually the couple decide that they're going to leave and go back together and be back in the relationship. And they try to drag themselves away, but like I find with some cultures of people that I visit, they won't let you go until they feed you. And the dad's like this, have another meal. Please stay a bit longer and eat some more. And it's lovely, right? He's trying his best to pour love and hospitality on these people. And eventually they drag themselves away from the hospitality, having put on 4 kilos. And they head back towards their home, but it's late at night. And the sun sets. The sun goes down. That's always a bad cue in all those 1950s movie where the couple's up in Lover's Lane and the monster taps on the window and bites his head off when he goes out. It's that kind of a clue, right? The sun goes down. And eventually the man goes, well, we better find somewhere to stay for the night. And here's kind of a little irony. His servant says, well, why don't we go into one of the Canaanite cities? And he's like, Canaanites? Canaanites? No way, I'm not going to go and spend a night in a Canaan. Do you know what those people are like? They're our enemies. They're filthy. And he actually kind of has partly a point. Because there's some stuff I need to tell you about Canaanite. Let me preach you a sermon of Canaanite religion. Okay, here it goes. Canaanite. Again, please don't cut this bit out of the tape and quote me as saying this. But a Canaanite view would be, number one, your big aim in life is to get rich. That sounds like it fits with some kind of preaching I hear even today. Your aim in life is to get rich. The way you do that when you're a farmer is fertility. You need fertile animals, sheep and goats pumping out lots of little offspring so you can sell them and eat them and be rich. You need your crops, your trees to be fertile. And by the way, you need your wife to be fertile so that you've got plenty of strong young sons and maybe daughters, although they're not as good. Sorry, I'm quoting Canaanite religion. And they'll work on your farm for you. And that way you'll get rich. And the way that you tempt the gods to be fertile, well, all of the fertility on earth comes from the gods. In fact, it comes from the gods' sexual activity. So when it rains, I'm not making this up. If you want to read some detail on this, read Richard Davidson's book, Flame of Yahweh, which looks at sexuality in the Old Testament. And he's got all these quotes from ancient cultures that say, when it rains, that's Baal ejaculating. You know Baal, the storm god, that's him coming, and then it rains. And you're thinking, why did I come here today? That's just so gross. And why didn't I bring an umbrella just in case it rains on the way home? Right? But that's what they taught. And so if you want fertility, this is pre-science, right? If you want fertility, you get the gods excited, baby, because as often as Baal, has a good time, the more it rains in our dry country, and the better off we are. Now you get the Elijah story where Elijah gets up and goes, there's not going to be any rain for 3.5 years. And the audience thinks, Baal's not going to get any for 3.5 years? Well, that's funny. And you kind of get the whole joke of what's going on in that story. So that's what they believed. So how do you turn the gods on? Easy, porn. You show them porn. How do you do that? We haven't invented the film camera yet. No, you reenact pornographic stuff in church. You go along to the temple and you watch a sex show and the gods are like, whoa, cool, that's a bit of nice human porn. Okay, great. And it rains. Okay, how gross is this? I'm not making this up. There's a lot of scholarly support for the evidence of this. The other way you turn the gods on is you go along to a sacred prostitute, guys. You pay your money and you enact the sacred mysteries of fertility. And you see this on every page of the Bible. It's kind of there in the King James. It says, and Israel went a-whoring after other gods. It's exactly, literally what they did. Or the NIV says, Israel prostituted themselves after other gods. And you think, that's because they were unfaithful. Yeah, it's more than that. It's that they're actually literally prostituting themselves to these other gods. And there were male prostitutes for women or for gay men. So every need or desire was pretty much catered for. Okay, so you've got that going on. Now here's a question. What does that kind of religion do to a society? What does it do to your view of women? There's a lot of evidence showing what porn does today to the status of women. What do you think it did back then? Where the chick next door who you go to the temple with, you know that maybe once a year she'll be on duty as the local shrine prostitute. So you're like, whoa. It reduces a woman to just one thing. Okay? And what does it do to family life? There's a snapshot in the book of Amos, this gutsy prophet who writes to Israel, and he says, you've copied the Canaanites because what happens? Father and son go to the temple together. Now, shouldn't that be a good thing? Don't you love seeing a dad modeling spirituality to his kids? I love that stuff, right? And I try to do it. But then off goes this father and son. They go to that temple, and what do? It says they both use the same girl. Ugh. Imagine being where your dad's just been in that way. Ugh. And then, or after, who goes first, and what do they talk about on the way home? And what does the son think about his mum? What does it do to that? What does it do to that boy's head? I think this just died. That's all right. I ditched the Madonna mic. Thank you. What does that do to a young guy's head when his dad and he have just been to the same girl? What do they talk about on the way home? And does the boy say to his father, what, Dad, mum's not enough? The love of one awesome woman is not enough for you? Is that what I'm meant to learn here? Should I conduct my relationships in that same way? It's hard to calculate the amount of damage that religion would do to a group of people. Blah. Add to that, and by the way, what does it do to sexual health? While we're talking about it, what does it do to disease? Funny that a fertility religion probably caused a whole bunch of infertility in the ancient world. Tragic stuff. And then you add to it the fact that Canaanites are also into child sacrifice. This is argued about in scholarly circles, I will admit, but I think there's a fair bit of evidence showing that one of the best ways you could impress those Canaanite gods was to bring the most precious thing you have, your child, and put them on a big barbecue plate. They've found what looks like cast idols out of metal, light a fire in the bottom, And the hands are out like this with a kind of a metal plate on them to receive children. And you have the audience standing around while you give your child to Baal. Don't worry, ma'am, your child will go straight to the arms of a loving deity. It may suffer for a few minutes here, but it'll be received by God in the afterlife and have an honoured position. Okay. And so you take the kid, and the audience is singing so that you can't hear the baby scream. And the audience is burning incense and that kind of thing, so you can't smell the odour of cooking human flesh. And they're worshipping this God. What kind of a sick God is that? What kind of a hideous distortion of the kind God who gives his own son for the sins of the world, not the other way around. That God's more like Satan, if you ask me. That's Satan just showing himself in the guise of good religion. And this is what's going on in Canaan. And so you can kind of understand this guy saying, no, I don't want to go and spend an evening with the Canaanites in a Canaanite city. Thanks very much. And so he toddles off to Gibeah of Benjamin. And he spends the night there. And if you read it, he sits in the town square and nobody comes to offer him hospitality. Now, in the ancient world, that's a bad thing. You're meant to do that. There are no hotels and motels. You're meant to come and say, come and stay in my barn, pal, or we've got a spare room. It's okay, you're welcome. And nobody does. So that's a big fail on behalf of that city. That's already a rebuke in the story. And then this other guy who lives there, but he's not actually from there originally, comes and says, come and stay with us. And they're like, no, we'll be fine. We'll just spend the night in the town square. He's like, no, don't spend the night in the town square. Come and spend the night with us. Okay, thanks. And they do. Long story short, it comes later, and all the men of the town come and throw themselves at the door of that man's house, and they say, bring out the man who came to you so that we may know him. You can probably work out what know him means. It doesn't mean shake his hand and have a conversation. This is in the Bible where Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and they had a child. So they're asking to bring this guy out for a bit of good old gangbang of the visiting male. Okay? That's what they're requesting to do. And now this story starts to sound like another story that you know. Which one? Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's so many parallels in this story. It's almost like this writer is purposely saying to you, this happened in Israel, but it might as well have happened in Sodom, because sometimes you can't tell the difference. Kind of a humbling thing for the people of faith to be compared to Sodom. But then again, even Jesus does that, right? He goes to these little towns. Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida. He says, if the mighty works that I've done in you had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have what? They would have repented. If Jesus had turned up and healed people and done those things in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented, says Jesus. You guys haven't repented. You guys haven't come to me. You're worse. You're worse, he says, to the Jews, the chosen people. You might as well be saying it to the church, right? Because that's our kind of spiritual ancestors. Okay? It's humbling stuff. And he's saying, if you know all this and turn away from the truth, you just go into this moral free fall. I'm not trying to scare anybody here, but that's what he's saying, that the city of Sodom is not quite as bad. But here's the twist. He says exactly what he's heard from the Sodom story. He goes out to them and he says, the old man of the house, he says, no, my brothers. That's very gracious. Not, no, you feral, filthy idiots. No, my brothers, don't do this terrible thing. And they're like, shut up, buddy, get out of the way. What's meant to happen at that point is the angel's meant to come out, strike the crowd blind. That's what happened in Sodom. Except it doesn't happen here. And he copies what he's seen Lot do. Because what does Lot do next? He says, yeah, here are my two virgin daughters that have never known a man. Let me bring them out to you. And you can do to them whatever you want, says Lot. So this guy goes, yeah, I've learned that in Sabbath school. Okay, that's what I meant to say. Here's my daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do whatever you want to them. But to this man, don't do this horrible thing. And he's expecting the same response that Lot would have got, which is, ooh, no thanks, we don't want a girl. We want male flesh. Thanks. And I think it's a clever ploy. I think it's kind of like offering a ham sandwich to a vegetarian, you know, because it looks very friendly and inclusive, but you know that they won't take your ham sandwich. Unless they're very, anyway, it's another story. So here's what's happening here. I think he's offering these guys a false offer. Here, take these two girls. But here's the surprise twist in the story. They say, okay, fine. And the woman goes out to them. Only the concubine goes. He somehow forgets to send his own daughter out. You can see a bit of self-interest there. And out she goes. And here comes one of the most tragic texts in the scriptures. The men wouldn't listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go, because that's what a woman is, right? That's what a woman's for. Who cares what she thinks and feels? It's what I think and feel that matters, right? There's the rape myth going on in that story. Tragic scene. And the writer doesn't, please, Richard Dawkins, the writer doesn't say, yeah, that's what women deserve, that's what she got, so what? It's a tragedy. It's a massive tragedy. And the writer, first of all, paints it with beautiful poignancy. He says, at daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her husband was staying. She fell down at the door and she lay there until daylight. What a shocker. She's lying there, wounded, bleeding, beaten up, internal injuries. Serious stuff, right? We're not kidding with this story. And then at dawn, up gets Clunkhead and he's like, quick, get up, let's go. Thanks, man. Like that's a great moment in manhood, isn't it? It's a great moment in protectiveness and love. You just let it happen all night. It doesn't say he listened or tried to go out and help or anything. And I know. We could spend all morning arguing about the rights and wrongs. What should you have done? Should he have stayed alive? If he'd gone out there, they probably would have killed him. Maybe he's trying to stay alive so he can help her the next morning. Maybe I think he's a bit of a selfish goose, actually. He's got this God-given gift of testosterone, right, which is put there to make people protective and as a kind of a tough kindness. Doesn't use it. He just sits in there and next morning, let's go. Okay, this is not a proud moment in the history of male behaviour, that's for sure, on either side. But then he said to her, get up. Oh, it says, with her hands on the threshold. That just breaks my heart. You see this lovely feminine hand reaching out for the door and nobody helps. And then, get up, let's go. And he puts her on his donkey and he takes her home. And then here's the bit that freaks people out. He cuts her up. He cuts the body up. She's died, apparently, although we're not really told exactly when. That's left a bit unclear. But she dies. And so he cuts up her body. And people think, oh, that's weird. He's a cannibal. He's Hannibal Lecter. Oh, he's a freak. No, in that culture, he's trying to bring publicity to the fact. This is, even still in that culture, there's a war going on, as you know. And when somebody on either side is killed, what do? They bring out their dead loved one and they parade them on a piece of wood through the streets. And they show you the smashed up, broken, blown up, glass-penetrated, bullet-holed body. And they go, look at what those did to the person I love. And it's a way of showing respect to the dead. It sounds weird to us because we are used to the closed coffin and the stiff upper lip and all that British kind of stuff, but not there. And so this is his way, bizarrely to us, of trying to honour her. And he cuts her up into 12 bits and he sends a courier to each of the 12 state capitals. And on market day, when everybody's in town, the courier opens the box and whoa, there's this gorgeous woman's lower leg, whoa, with flies buzzing around it. Oh my word. And there's a message. And it says, look what's been done to the woman that I love. Come and sort this out. And the writer emphasizes that all the men, I think he says it about 6 times, all the men of Israel get together and they go, this is wrong. This is the time when Israel's really dropped into immorality big time. But even those deadheads, even those moral compromisers can work out this is wrong. We talked about the moral argument yesterday, right? Anybody can see that this is wrong. Mass rape and, oh my word. And so all the men get together, angry and just, and trying to go, hang on, there's a right and wrong again. Yeah, we've kind of lost it in our worship of Baal, but okay, we can see that it's true. And they have this big assembly. And they say to the tribe of Benjamin, bring out the men who did this so we can give them justice. And the tribe of Benjamin says, get lost. Huh? Okay, we will fight you if you don't. And Benjamin goes, fine, bring it on. We've got the best slingers and bowmen in the whole nation. Bring it on. And there's this horrible civil war. And God seems absent. He's barely mentioned. And then eventually they call out to God, what do we do? What do we do? And in the middle of this civil war, and eventually they start to win. And they, in fact, do such a good job that they wipe out the tribe of Benjamin pretty much. And then they go, oh, whoops, oh, we just wiped out the tribe of Benjamin. Oh, you can't do that. There's got to be 12 tribes. Otherwise, we're weaker. We all know there's got to be 12. Quick, we've got to build up the tribe of Benjamin again. It's like, you idiots. You've just bombed the heck out of Iraq. Oh, sorry, that's a different story. You've just blown Benjamin away, and now you want to build it up again? How do you build up the tribe of Benjamin? Well, there's really only one way. They need women. Great. lovely to send your daughter to some of the Benjamites, wouldn't it? And they've actually taken a vow. I'll never give my daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. They think, but we have to give women to the Benjamites. And so they work out all these ways to get women kind of pushed into marrying a Benjamite. And they have this big cultural dance. All the dads get together and say, how are we going to let the Benjamites take our daughters? Well, we've promised we won't give our daughters to a Benjamite, but what if we let them take them? And so there's this stupid scene where the dads all pull back and this women's cultural dancing festival's going on, and the Benjamites rush in and basically grab their wife off the dance floor, take her home. It's like caveman stuff. Grab a woman, take home. Ooh, it's that. And the story ends. And the story ends. And you can see the results of becoming like a Canaanite. Who suffers? Women suffer. Who else suffers? Men on the battlefield suffer. It's a mess. And at the end of it, I couldn't control myself. If I was writing the book of Judges, I'd be going, look what happens when you ditch a kind, loving, fair God of covenant love and follow Baal. Look what you turn into. I'd be having a bit of a preach there, right? But the writer of the book is much more restrained, and he says, at that time, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. I get it. Okay. So the problem is, they didn't have a moral authority making laws for them, and everyone just followed their own morality. We talked about that yesterday. The individual, I'm good enough to work up my own morality. But hang on a second. 50% of the people involved in a rape enjoy it in a sick way. Right? So if the individual makes up my own rules, maybe I'm going to make up the rule that it's okay to rape people. You get the stupid extremes that we're capable of. And the writer's basically trying to say, if you've got no king, if you've got no lawmaker, if you've got no sense of Yahweh as a good God, look at what you can do. And it's kind of meant to be a cautionary tale. So for Richard Dawkins to turn around and say, oh yeah, that's just normal, that's just the way women were expected to be treated in the Old Testament, yabba, 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 it's absolutely unfair. And this from a guy who's a member of the Royal Society of Literature. Understands. In that commentary, he doesn't quote one commentator on this story. Not one Jewish one, not one Christian one, not one atheist one, and there are some very good atheist Bible commentators out there. Doesn't even quote anyone. He just tells you what he thinks the story means. But it's ridiculous. It's like me saying, oh, I've read Macbeth, and obviously Shakespeare's in favour of the killing of Scottish kings. No. Shakespeare shows you what happens if a guy steps outside of morality and kills the king. There's horrible consequences. It'd be just as dumb as saying that. And I've got to say this too, when you read the book of Judges, you see that line, doing what's right in your own eyes, that's just so witty, I cannot tell you. Because the book of Judges starts in the early chapters, read it like a novel, it's a cracking good book. In the early chapters, you see people turning their backs on God, going after other idols, and you see this big vicious cycle that happens. It's like this big wheel of addiction that just keeps going on. They're going along fine, they ditch God, and then God just says, okay, I won't butt into your lives, I'll leave you be, and they get smashed in warfare by some other nation, they get taken as slaves, and they hit rock bottom. And they're slaves for 20 years or something, and they call out to God. That's all, just call out to God. They don't earn anything, they don't deserve anything, it's absolutely by grace alone. They call out to God, help! Best prayer you can ever pray. No matter what you've just done, however stupid and sinful and whatever you've just been, call out to God. And God steps in and sends them a deliverer who comes in and kicks butt and pulls the people out of the stupid state their sin has gotten them into for nothing, for love. Pulls them out of it. Wins, breaks this captivity. How gospel is this? Gets them back into a good condition again. Wow, that's great. But do they stay there? No, they don't. They turn back to Baal, to this sexy, pornified God worship. We can understand it, right? Imagine the attendance that a pornified church would get today in this society. But then they turn back to that, and then the cycle happens again, and they get to rock bottom, and they call out to God, and He graciously intervenes. And this goes on 6 or 8 times, until the people think it's normal. They think that's how you're normally meant to live a life. No, you're not. You're actually meant to stay in faithful covenant relationship with God. I know we all sin, but we're not just to think, oh, that's just a cycle, and just keep stuck in it. The gospel's more powerful than that. The empowering Spirit of God has got a bit more grunt to it than that. Okay, that gentle dove has got some serious muscle. Okay, and so you see this just going on, and eventually it breaks to bits. You see, you think it's a cycle. And by the way, that's the pagan view of history. History just goes round and round and round through the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. That's their view. Hebrews come along and go, no, history goes in a straight line. And the line points up if God's involved. And eventually that all blows apart. And every time they're doing wrong, it says they're doing wrong in the eyes of Yahweh. They did wrong in the eyes of Yahweh, eyes of Yahweh, eyes of Yahweh, eyes of Yahweh. That's the big idea of that story. They ignored the eyes of God, God's view on everything. And then, later on in the story, that all blows to bits. Read it and you'll see it slowly happening. And then along comes Samson. And right in the middle of the book, Samson comes along. And what does he do? He looks at all these hot women, these Philistine women. And his dad says, you can't marry a Philistine, son. And he goes, get her for me. She looks good in my eyes. And it's all about Samson's eyes. And he's constantly seeing women and falling in love with women based on the look of them. Nothing wrong with that, except in this story. And then, what happens to Samson in the end? Psh, has his eyes poked out. And after that, you don't hear about God's eyes anymore. All you hear is about what the people want to do. And you get to the end of the book of Judges, and it's all about my eyes. It's all about what I see. You can see that the moral reference point has shifted. It's no longer God, it's me. And that's the powerful message of the book. I'm not a good enough guide for myself, like we said yesterday. I need an objective source of truth and morality, and it's called God. Right? And so you come to the end of that book and you just go, I don't want to follow my own eyes. I don't want to be wise in my own eyes. I want to humbly walk with what God tells me and love him. And that's what you're meant to see. Now, to turn around and say that's a horribly sexist story, I think it's anything but. There's horrible sexist moments in it. Her common law husband's a bit of a nit. But that's not a story that says, oh yeah, women, that's what happens to women. Doesn't matter. It matters massively. And I think to say the Bible's horribly sexist based on that is just a lazy reading of the story. Right? If you tried that in your high school English class, you'd get a fail. Right? So for me, that's one of the toughest chapters. But when you actually bother to read it, I don't think it's that bad at all. Questions or comments on that before we move on? Anyone need counselling? It's a bit of a tough one, isn't it? No worries. Alrighty. Well, look, let's look at the second toughest one, the issue of God ordering the destruction of the Canaanites. And to be fair, let's compare it to some other historical questions. Bombing of Hiroshima. I'm not here to tell you that was a good thing. It was a great moment in human history. But I can tell you this. At the time, the Allies looked at it, and people like Winston Churchill and others thought, if we attack Japan with soldiers, send our armies in, we could lose up to 3 million of our troops, between 1 and 3 million of our troops. They saw what happened on Okinawa. When the Allies took the island of Okinawa, the Japanese had a policy. We're going to take down 7 of you for every one of us that goes. We know we're going to lose, but we're going to make you pay a price. And they realized also that they could kill between 1 and 3 million Japanese people in the invasion of the Japanese homeland. And so they made the hideous decision that it might be more moral to bomb a few 100,000 people in Hiroshima and then a few days later in Nagasaki than to kill millions of theirs and of ours. Now, I'm not telling you that that's right or wrong. I think that's a massive grey question. But I wanted to raise that as a kind of a comparison, because sometimes you can read these things in the Bible and say, here's God telling them to go and kill Canaanites. That's terrible. Yes, it is terrible. But when you understand it in its historical context, it's a bit less easy to be, a bit tougher to be more judgmental. What I meant to say, it's a bit tougher to be judgmental. Another example, in the Battle of the Bulge, that was kind of Hitler's pushback after D-Day, right? The Americans and Brits and others land in D-Day, and they start pushing through France. They get across towards Germany, and Hitler goes, this is it, last push. Sends a whole bunch of people through. And the Battle of the Bulge, read up on it on Wiki or something, fascinating story. One of the groups involved on Hitler's side in the Battle of the Bulge was a bunch of teenagers, boys of 13, 14, 15, from the Hitler Youth. Why? So many of the adult men had been killed, sadly, in Hitler's crazy wars and his mad leadership, that it was down to boys now. A whole bunch of boys go in and fight against American and British troops, I think Canadians too, in the Battle of the Bulge. Here's a question. If some 13-year-old Nazi was coming at you in the Battle of the Bulge, armed to the teeth, head full of philosophy that you're an inferior person, you need to be wiped out, you're threatening the Führer's dream, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's a tough question. And I'm not saying I've got a really neat answer written here in my notes here somewhere. I haven't. I don't know what I'd do. I think I'd probably fight back because it's a war. And if I don't, I get killed. My army gets defeated. My civilization gets taken over by Hitler. Read the book Fatherland. It's a novel, but it has this kind of fictional future where Hitler actually wins World War II. Rules all of Europe, rules all the way across to Russia. Americans come on side. Joseph Kennedy takes Nazism as a really good thing, and the whole world basically lives under this massive era of fascism. That's not a future that you want. And so I would think that even kind soldiers who love kids fought back on that day. And if you're going to fight, you fight hard so that you win. And this is kind of the dilemma that you find yourself in. More recently, I was just making a film in Kenya, one of the worst slums in Kenya. It's in the film The Constant Gardener, actually, the slum of Kibera. Tragic place. And in that place, there's a bunch of kids that grow up, and you've got two choices. One is you go to school, and you get a job, and you be a useful person, hopefully, right? You'll be prejudiced against because you've come from there, and it'll be tough for you, and you may not succeed, but at least you'll have a chance. Or you join a gang. If you join a gang, we were hanging out with the police. We were hanging out with these lovely police. They were escorting us around as we were filming. In fact, they said to us, with your cameras, you couldn't make 100 metres across this slum if we weren't with you. There's police packing AK-47s coming with us, right? And we said, take us to the worst places. And they said, okay. There was this lovely policewoman. I cannot tell you what a kind, motherly person. Had young kids at home. She's a real sweetie, and we got to know her quite well. There's another big, tough man there that worked with her. Lovely people. Christians, actually, for what that's worth. And they're working in there. And I said, so I said, did you work last night? Yeah, we worked last night. What did you do? Oh, we killed about 8 guys from a gang. You really? You gunned them down? Yep. Right. And so you hear about these gangs. What do? They basically rob and rape. That's what they do. They're never going to get a girlfriend or a wife, so they figure, she looks all right. She's walking home from work from the station. Bam, into a back alley. Boom. Or he looks like he's got a few bob from working in the city. Bang, crack on the head, take your stuff. So these gangs, that's how they live. And they have guns, and if they see the police, they fire on them, and the police fire back. Now, if you were a cop in Kibera, what would you do? Would you read them a little lecture on moral philosophy? Would you say, Jesus loves you? Would you? No, I think you'd pull out your big AK-47 and kill them before they killed you and some other kid in Kibera. I'm not here defending violence, but I'm saying in that context, what other response is there? What other rational, sensible response is there? And I think that's probably a helpful historical comparison to the dilemma that the Israelites faced in taking on the Canaanites. And I could read you texts in the Bible that order the destruction of the Canaanites. We won't take all that time this morning, but in Deuteronomy, it's made pretty clear what you're meant to do. Deuteronomy 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you're entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you've defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Snappers, that's a tough one. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you're going to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles. That was basically a great big stone penis, basically a great big stone phallic symbol that they would have there. For you're a people holy to your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the people on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. And by the way, in case you're getting cocky about that, here's the next bit. The Lord did not set his affection on you or choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples. You were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you
and kept the oath he swore to his ancestors, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of Pharaoh. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. But those who hate him, he will repay to their face by destruction. He will not be slow to repay to their face those who hate him. So take care to follow the commands, decrees, and laws I give you today. It's like God's being very honest. And that sounds a bit harsh to us until we think about the good old New Testament gospel that Paul preaches. What does he say? The wages of sin is death. And we quickly hurry on to the next bit. The gift of God is eternal life. Phew. I hope I get that bit through faith. I know I will. But the first bit's there still too, isn't it? And this is a side of God that it isn't fun to talk about. But I'm glad it's there. How do we deal with those kind of texts? Just quickly, I'll give you, without turning this into a theology lecture, I'll give you a few examples from contemporary theology of how people deal with it. Here's one way. Read Deuteronomy 7 and think it applies to you today. And you've got to kill whatever enemy it is that you're facing. Maybe it's the Muslims. Right? Maybe that's how we should treat Muslims in this country. I've heard Christians say that. In American history, maybe it's the Native Americans. We should just wipe them out because they're like the Canaanites. If you're a Jew, you might want to apply it to the Palestinians who are competing for your homeland. If you're an Afrikaner rather, if you're a Dutch person going to South Africa back in the day, you might want to see it as black Africans. Whoa, this is getting kind of freaky, isn't it? Please note, I'm not improving any of these ways of reading it. You might want to see it as somebody who runs an abortion clinic. Some Christians have done it that way. These people are killing young children and getting in the way of the kingdom of God. Let's blow them up. I think that would be a misreading. Why? Because the Bible makes the command to Israel about the Canaanites, not to me about anybody. Important principle. You've got to know where the message is actually targeted. And not just read everything like it applies to you. That's the less common way to read it. The most common way is that Christians will say, well, that happened in the Old Testament, but it doesn't happen in the New Testament. And that's how, they kind of say, well, that's how God was, but now he's a God of grace and love. He used to be a bit of a kick-butt, nasty Old Testament kind of God, but let's not talk about that because we don't really understand it. Let's quickly move into the New Testament where he's all about love and grace. Except that, number one, the Old Testament often shows God's love. Again and again. In fact, even in there you hear God saying, I just chose you because I loved you. You weren't bigger or more impressive than any other nation. I just chose you out of love. There's a million other texts I could find. And second of all, the New Testament often shows God's justice. Let me ask you a question. What day in history will have the highest body count of any day? The second coming of Jesus. Right? He's not kidding around. For me, that's a blessed hope because I'm a sinner that found grace. But for a majority of people alive at that time, what will it be? Calling for the rocks and the mountains to fall on them. That's freaky stuff. Hide me from the eyes of the face sitting on the throne. Far out. So the New Testament equally portrays God's justice. And also, Jesus and the apostles didn't seem to have a problem with these stories. They taught about these Old Testament stories as they were absolute true revelations of who God is. Not just was, but is. We could go much more into that, but time would beat us. Thirdly, some writers will say God didn't actually make that command, the Jews just made it up. They just looked for an excuse for all the wars they wanted to fight, and so they wrote that into their Bible. There's some serious scholars that will say that. Well, I have a problem with that because there's a lot of places where God is quite capable of stepping in and rebuking excess violence. He rebukes Jehu for it. He rebukes other people for the way that they've been violent. And all through the Bible is this whole idea of you're going to get your promised land. And when you think about it, if you're going to get your promised land, somebody else is going to lose that land. It's right there when God first talks to Abraham about your descendants will be slaves, but then they'll come back here in 400 years. Genesis 15. And he says to him, because the Canaanites, or Amorites, have not yet filled up their cup of iniquity. In other words, I'm giving them grace and space and time to decide if they're going to live for love and truth or for selfishness and destructiveness. And I know what they're going to decide, but I still want to be fair and give them time to show it to the world. And then eventually I'll come in and I'll wipe them out. I'll give you their land. Whoa. It's right. It's not just in one text that somebody kind of hastily scribbled into the Bible. It's right through the Old Testament. The other thing that some people do with these is to spiritualize it all away. And today we're actually, in another way, talking about how to read the Bible and how not to. Preachers often get to these texts and they want to spiritualize it all away, and they say, they defeated the Canaanites in Israel. Let's not talk about that. What are the Canaanites in your life? Maybe you've got a Canaanite of fear. Maybe you've got a big fat Canaanite of low self-esteem and you need to kick it out of your life, right? Maybe you've got a big Canaanite of addiction. That's a horrible one. Get your sling out and whack it right between the eyes and look to Jesus. And, you can see what they're trying to do. That's nice. I hope you do defeat all those things if you're struggling with them. That's a good message, but it's not actually what this text is talking about. And so often we'll find a text that, oh yeah, that's convenient, that'll work. I want to say this, and that seems to kind of somehow fit with it, rather than going, what does the Bible actually say? And that's sloppy preaching. It's well-intentioned, and it can bless people, I guess, but it's not really the right way to read the texts. You can also just come out and say, well, these texts show God's dark side. A fifth way that some scholars do is to say, well, sometimes God just has a grumpy day. If that's true, we're all in such trouble anyway. It's almost not worth arguing with that one. A sixth way is some scholars will say God is God, so our morals don't apply to him. That's partly true, except that God never uses that excuse. You see him often saying in the Bible, be holy because I am holy. You hear Jesus saying, follow me, not do what I say, not what I do, son. Okay? So I don't think that one works. Number 7, some well-meaning scholars will try to separate the textual God from the actual God. There's a book published recently by a guy called Siebert. And what he does is he says, you first of all, you go and read what Jesus is like, and then you go back to the Old Testament and you say, that's like Jesus or that's not like Jesus. That is like Jesus or that's not like Jesus. And you go through and you throw out certain passages that don't work. He says, stop trying to justify God's behavior in the Old Testament and go back and just find the good bits and use them and chuck out the bad bits. You see a problem with that? I see a massive, massive problem with that. Let me ask you this question. Who's the authority? Who has the right to be the authority about what the truth is? Is it scholars like that guy? I'm a scholar like that guy. If I want to be cocky, I've got one more doctorate than he's got. Right? If you want to be snooty about that stuff, let me show you. I'm not the guy that you want as your moral authority. I'm a broken, sinful, stupid human being who's discovered grace and loves it and who God is changing over time. But I don't want to be anybody's moral authority. I've struggled to run my own life, right? I need massive help every day. I don't think any human being ought to be up there going, this is God's word and that's not God's word. We'll go through the Bible, because the convenient way to do that is just to read the bits you like. I hate the bit about loving your neighbour. I want to just read that other bit. And that's my problem with that. This guy's trying to follow Jesus, but let me ask you another question. How did Jesus read the Old Testament? Do you ever hear Jesus going through the Old Testament going, that bit's in, that bit's out? This bit does reveal God, that bit doesn't. No. He talked about some of God's destructive moments. For example, he talks about the story of Sodom, doesn't he? And he says to people, remember Lot's wife. In other words, God's still the same, and people who turn their backs on God won't be safe, right? And so that's a real issue. You've got a few choices as to who's going to be the authority. As we said yesterday, morally, it can either be the church. While I love the church, let me assure you that the church does some pretty dumb things at times. There's nothing sometimes dumber than a committee. And if you can let that be your moral authority, I promise you pain. Right? Second one is scholars and theologians. Don't trust us. We're just as needy as you are. Okay. Third one, in fact, question everything I tell you. Check it against that book. The other option is to maybe let yourself be your authority. We talked about that yesterday. That's not going to work. I'd suggest the only person it's safe to have as the authority in your life is God. And that the best way God has expressed himself is in all the writings of the Bible. That all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is useful. That's my firm belief. Without that, you're on a slippery slope. Something else is your authority. And as soon as you do what Siebert does and go through the text, this is in, this is out, gone. And by the way, if Siebert wanted to, he could turn that like Jesus, not like Jesus trick onto Jesus himself. And he could go, here's Jesus talking about destruction. Here's Jesus talking about, don't be afraid of people who can kill your body. Be afraid of people who can kill your soul in hell. Wow, that doesn't sound like Jesus. We'll punt that out of the park. So you can even turn that like Jesus, not like Jesus, on Jesus himself. And suddenly everything's gone to flubber, right? Suddenly there's nothing solid in your belief system. I think that's pretty much self-defeating. So, what can we say? Very, very quickly. First of all, we can say these texts were never meant as instruction, even for all wars, let alone for all time. They were never meant as that. Secondly, they assume that Canaanite culture had horrific human rights abuses. If you're dealing with a group of people that are into child sacrifice, that are into hideous violence, what would you do? Let me read you quickly about the Canaanite goddess of sex and war, Anat. There's a picture of her in the French, in the Louvre. And here's a description of it. The blood was so deep that she waded in it up to her knees, nay, up to her neck. Under her feet were human heads. Above her, human hands flew like locusts. In her sensuous delight, she decorated herself with suspended heads while she attached hands to her girdle. Her joy at butchery is described in more sadistic language. Her liver swirled with laughter. Her heart was full of joy. A bunch of people who love bloodshed and who follow that goddess coming at you on a battlefield. What are you going to do? You're going to fight. And you're not going to fight weakly. You're going to fight effectively. And you're going to realize if you don't finish the job, they'll just be back. It's horrible, dark advice. But in that context, what other advice can actually work? Just a third thing too, I think we can say, the Bible constantly shows God as trying to achieve good outcomes, constantly using both justice and kindness in complicated ways to achieve that. We could spend a whole hour on that idea alone. Fourthly, we can say this war was really strictly pinned down. You weren't allowed to feel superior to the other race that you were fighting. There was no racism in it. There was no profit motive. You weren't allowed to take their stuff. And this was God just basically saying, look, in these circumstances, respond. Respond. I wish we had time this morning to talk about the one Canaanite who's a star in the Bible. It's a woman, Rahab. What does she do? She lives in Jericho, which is a Canaanite stronghold. What's her job? She's a hooker. The rabbis try to say, no, she was a waitress. It's clear from the text. She's a hooker. What happens? The two spies come into town, and she can tell, I guess, from their clothing that they're from a different culture, and she's like, whoa. And they just happen to walk into her little establishment, which is by the wall. Her house, she only had to build 3 walls of it. The other one is the wall of the city. She'd never get any sunlight in there. Terrible problem with mold. It's a cheap part of town. She's a poor girl. What does she do? She takes them up onto the roof of her house. Interesting detail. What's up on the roof? What does she hide them under? Stalks of flax. What's flax? Flax is a little plant that grows in the rivers nearby, and still to this day, it's the source of the most comfortable linen. If you sleep in a 5-star hotel, and don't we all wish, you're probably sleeping on flax-made sheets. It's just wonderful stuff. She's actually got a bit of flax drying on her roof. What does that tell you? She's trying to earn an income in another way. She's trying to start a small business. Okay? Already she probably hates what she does, and she's trying to break free of all of that. It seems like God's active in her life, even before she meets these Jews. What does she do? At risk to herself, she hides them up on the roof. And then she lies, no way around it, she lies to the soldiers and said, they've gone that way, and so off go the soldiers. And then that night, she comes up again to talk to the guys, and when you read it, you can't believe how she talks. She doesn't talk like a Canaanite at all. She says, I know that Yahweh is the God of heaven and earth. Really? I've heard about your history, how you defeated these great big other nations that came against you. I've seen how God made a bunch of a puny little nation like yours defeat these big bad guys. Clearly God's on your side. Really? And she says, now, let's make a covenant. What? Covenant? That's Jewish language. That's the center of their religion. Covenant. Let's make a covenant. My life for your life. I won't destroy you. I'll save your life, and when you come back, you save my life. Really? That's how we talk. That's covenant talk. By comparison, imagine a couple of American Baptist paratroopers, right? They lob into the middle of an Al-Qaeda stronghold in some war. And they meet this veiled woman, and she saves their lives, even though they're the enemy. They're like, why did you do that? And she says, let's make a covenant. I've shown you grace, you show me grace. Grace? How do you know about grace? That's our word. That defines our religion. What are you doing with grace in your vocabulary? That's the shock when this woman says, let's make a covenant. Really? And you can tell that the ideas of Israel, the beautiful ideas of God's love in a formal sense for the world, have made it into her head. She's heard them somewhere, and she's grabbed them. And I think that's the big counterexample where God goes, it's not that I hate Canaanites. It's not that I hate a race, any race of people. I just can see when a culture has gone so bad that it's not salvageable. I'll pull out as many individuals as I can, but then I'll just let it shut down. And if you think about it in the last days context, that's exactly what's going to happen again. And God's going to pull out a few people who truly want him in love and truth, pull them together and bring them to himself for forever. Wish we had way more time on this complicated topic, but my bottom line is this. I don't think you have to be ashamed of any part of the Bible. You just have to read the blooming thing right. I don't think you have to be embarrassed about anything the Bible says. If you read it, 2 tricks. Read the words carefully, think about the historical context, and it's called historical grammatical exegesis if you really want to know, but that's really all you're doing, just reading what it actually says, trying to read it as a whole book, a whole work of literature, and reading it within its historical context, and it makes, I think, a hang of a lot more sense. Happy to chat if you've got questions afterwards. We better let you guys go. Let me pray for us. God, we've talked about some pretty hairy stuff this morning, and I just ask that you'd give us a sense, first of all, of just how stinking rotten sin is, how destructive and how dark it is, even our little pet ones that we think are going to be okay. Pray that you give us a sense of what an ugly, damnable thing it is. And then, by contrast, help us to see just how stunningly awesome your grace is, that it can pull us out of that it can forgive us for the stupid things we've done, that it can build a whole new set of aims and ambitions and feelings into our hearts. It can make us love the things we used to hate the things we used to love, and lean towards goodness and want love and truth and all that stuff, which I think, speaking for me, naturally, I'd just stay as a battleground and end up destroying myself. So I want to thank you that you've stepped into human history in justice and also in grace. I want to thank you above all that all the just consequences in the world fell on Christ on the cross, that all the guilt and gunk of human sin was absorbed by him and taken so that we don't have to carry it. I don't even begin to get what that means, but it blows me away. I want to thank you too that all the grace and love that you could have poured onto us, you did through the cross. And you've shown us that you'd rather cop the punishment for our sins than just leave us flailing around down here. I pray that we trust you. Pray that we be good Bible readers, able to understand what you're trying to say. Pray too that we'd be able to defend your word to others and explain it so that people who genuinely want to know the truth might see that it is what you said it is, a source of grace and truth and talking about Jesus. Just bless everybody here, God. Give us a fun day today, and thank you in Christ's name. Amen.